Welcome to the Clara and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claraandhoratio.com. Imagine holding the absolute most powerful military in the world at bay, not with a better army, but by simply threatening to close a single 21-mile-wide strip of water.
You were talking about the Strait of Hormuz, which is essentially the focal point of the entire globe today.
It really is, and we're beginning with a concrete diplomatic maneuver attempting to diffuse exactly that kind of massive global vulnerability. Today is Sunday, June 21st, 2026, and United States Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian officials, including their parliamentary speaker, are actually in Switzerland for direct talks starting today.
The immediate stakes surrounding these negotiations are just difficult to overstate. Iran's military is officially claiming to have completely closed the Strait of Hormuz. They are framing this closure as direct retaliation for recent Israeli strikes in Lebanon.
Wait, they're arguing those strikes constitute a breach of that newly signed agreement with the United States.
That is their explicit argument. However, U.S. Central Command actively disputes the physical closure of the strait. They state that maritime traffic continues to flow, noting specifically that 55 merchant ships successfully transited the waterway on Saturday.
I mean, we need to put the economic consequence of that specific waterway into perspective for you, the listener. It is essentially the carotid artery of the global energy supply. In 2025, about 20 million barrels of oil and oil products flowed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day,
Which translates to nearly $600 billion worth of energy trade a year.
So a sustained closure wouldn't just be a geopolitical headache. It would trigger a massive global energy shock. You would see an immediate spike in inflation worldwide, directly hitting household budgets through soaring fuel, manufacturing, and transportation costs.
And the diplomatic framework attempting to contain this immediate threat centers on a memorandum of understanding signed earlier this week by President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian.
What does the core mechanism of that agreement actually look like?
It essentially involves the U.S. waiving substantial sanctions, unfreezing billions in Iranian assets, and lifting regional blockades. In exchange for that, Iran has formally agreed to ensure the strait remains open and to end the broader regional war that escalated so sharply on February 28th.
But doesn't this deal effectively reward Iran's strategy of choking a global economic choke point? I mean, the Iranian regime survived the joint U.S.-Israel military campaign that began in February, and frankly, they appear emboldened.
The incentive structure does seem entirely backward. They have realized that leveraging control over the Strait of Hormuz is far cheaper and produces a much faster global panic than relying entirely on funding their regional network of proxy militias.
And that strategic realization in Tehran has to be driving the historic schism we are seeing between Washington and Jerusalem.
It is fracturing the long-standing U.S.-Israel alliance under the weight of this new geopolitical reality. J.D. Vance has explicitly told Israel to halt its military operations in Lebanon in order to preserve the broader negotiated deal with Iran.
Which places Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a catastrophic political crisis. He staked his entire political survival on eliminating the Iranian threat entirely.
Now he faces direct accusations from Washington of sabotaging international peace efforts by continuing preemptive strikes against Hezbollah.
That high-level diplomatic maneuvering in Switzerland is happening an ocean away from the concrete ground reality, where the human cost of this ongoing regional conflict remains just devastating. Over the weekend, the loss of civilian life included Mona Khalil, a 76-year-old Lebanese environmental activist.
She was a true institution in southern Lebanon. She dedicated over 25 years of her life to protecting endangered sea turtles at Mansouri Beach.
And she refused to leave her home, operating under the assumption that her clear status as a civilian non-combatant would keep her safe. She was fatally wounded in an Israeli strike and passed away on Friday.
That tragic loss in Lebanon runs parallel to the deeply complex and lethal situation continuing in Gaza. On Saturday, an Israeli strike in central Gaza killed Al Jazeera cameraman Ahmed Wisha.
Did the Israel Defense Forces release a statement about that specific strike?
They did. The IDF alleges that Wisha was a Hamas sniper who advanced attack plans against Israeli troops.
Al Jazeera strongly condemns that claim, though. They are explicitly calling his death part of a continued systematic policy of targeting journalists to silence on-the-ground reporting.
And this happened alongside another overnight strike in Gaza City that killed 4 members of a single family, including 2 children.
These continuous casualties really force us to look at the utter failure of recent governance plans meant to stabilize the region. Following the October 2025 ceasefire, there were extensive plans for a board of peace and an apolitical Palestinian technocrat committee,
institutions that were meant to govern Gaza and distribute aid, but they simply have not materialized.
Instead of a planned handover of civil power, Prime Minister Netanyahu directed the military in May to expand physical control over 70% of the territory. The United Nations is now reporting that 1,007 Palestinians have been killed since that ceasefire went into effect.
The nature of these long-range aerial attacks in the Middle East is mirroring a shifting technological paradigm in Europe, where the theater of war is increasingly being felt deep inside Russian borders.
You are talking about the massive Ukrainian drone assault that recently targeted a Moscow oil refinery.
I am. Thick black smoke hung visibly over the Russian capital, yet local residents carried on with a surreal sense of normalcy. People were filmed fishing in nearby ponds, and children were playing in parks right across from the actively burning facility.
We have to scrutinize the domestic narrative being fed to the Russian public, though. Russian state media and government-aligned papers are aggressively coordinating a very specific message across all channels. They keep repeating that Ukraine is suffering more.
They are attempting to convince the public that Russian strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure are far more devastating than the fires burning in Moscow.
But that domestic propaganda reveals a desperate attempt to mask the very real compounding pressure building on the Russian economy. There are increasing reports of petrol shortages and steadily rising prices at the pumps directly resulting from these long-range Ukrainian strikes on energy facilities.
This drone-dominated battlefield reality is driving a massive, highly visible military buildup next door in Germany. At the Berlin Military Air Show, an absolute gold rush atmosphere has taken hold among defense contractors.
Because the German defense budget has hit $125 billion for 2026.
Startups are securing massive government contracts for disposable combat drones, which the industry politely calls loitering munitions. Chancellor Friedrich Merz has officially declared aerospace a key strategic sector.
We are witnessing a long-term structural militarization of European industry. I read that even traditional printing press manufacturers are attempting to pivot into drone defense systems to secure government revenue.
It illustrates how thoroughly a massive influx of defense capital can rewire a nation's entire industrial base.
While Germany is aggressively arming itself against external threats, its neighbor is facing a fierce internal battle over democratic institutions and public information. For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarinhoratio.com. Looking at the Czech Republic, the government has introduced a new bill to completely scrap public broadcasting license fees.
Funding for Czech television and Czech radio will be moved directly to the state budget, which is projected to cut tens of millions of euros from their operational budgets starting in 2027.
This legislative maneuver has triggered intense civic alarm, hasn't it? Media watchdogs like Reporters Without Borders are calling the move outright financial blackmail.
Placing public broadcasters directly on the state payroll sets the stage for severe political interference. If a news division investigates the ruling party, the government can simply threaten to slash their operational budget for the following year.
Observers warn this closely mirrors the state capture of public media recently executed by governments in nearby Hungary and Slovakia. Let me present the government's counter-argument, though, because at face value, their rationale appeals to economic fairness.
The populist Czech prime minister argues that a flat license fee, which is currently about $9 a month, is fundamentally regressive.
He argues it is unfair to poorer households who are forced to pay the exact same rate as wealthy citizens. The government also points to Western Europe, noting that countries like France and Scandinavian nations have successfully moved their public broadcasters to direct state funding without destroying their democracies.
The critical mechanism separating the Czech proposal from those Western European models lies in legal protections. When countries like France made the shift to state funding, they built strict legal firewalls into the legislation.
Firewalls that aggressively protect editorial independence by guaranteeing funding levels for multiple years,
isolating the journalists from the politicians holding the national purse strings. The current Czech legislation lacks these structural safeguards entirely.
In response to this perceived threat to democratic oversight, hundreds of thousands of citizens have signed petitions, massive protests are occurring in Prague, and broadcast staff are actively preparing to strike.
We are seeing a similar erosion of trust in public infrastructure playing out on a much larger scale in India, where a massive wave of student-led protests is currently sweeping across the country.
The civic infrastructure meant to guarantee meritocracy and social mobility is buckling under systemic corruption.
The specific crisis centers on the NEET UG medical entrance exam scandal. Roughly 2.2 million students are currently retaking this incredibly high-stakes test under extreme security measures.
The Indian Air Force has even been deployed to deliver sealed exam papers across the country.
This unprecedented logistical response follows the initial exams in May, which were heavily compromised. Widespread question paper leaks were actively sold on the encrypted messaging app Telegram, destroying the integrity of the entire testing cycle.
The human impact of this institutional failure is simply tragic. For millions of Indian families, this exam is the singular path out of poverty. At least 12 students have taken their own lives over the last month due to the extreme pressure, despair, and fear surrounding the compromised test and the mandated retest.
Civic outrage has materialized in a new youth-led movement calling themselves the Cockroach Janta Party, symbolizing their resilience against a toxic system.
They are holding overnight protests at historic demonstration grounds in New Delhi, demanding the immediate resignation of India's Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan and holding the government fully accountable for the compromised testing network.
This grassroots desperation contrasts sharply with the country's elite financial momentum. On Friday, billionaire Mukesh Ambani announced a potential $4 billion initial public offering for his telecom and tech unit, Geo Platforms.
This upcoming market debut highlights a stark national dichotomy. You have a booming, globally competitive, upper-tier tech and artificial intelligence economy operating right alongside fundamental public education and testing infrastructures that are utterly failing ordinary citizens.
That specific disconnect between stratospheric corporate wealth and basic public well-being serves as the perfect lens to examine a historic financial filing in the United States.
SpaceX has officially filed for an IPO aiming to raise $75 billion. This capital injection could value the aerospace company at an astonishing $1.75 trillion.
For Elon Musk, who holds a massive equity stake, this valuation would likely push his personal net worth past the $1 trillion mark, making him the first trillionaire in recorded human history.
Translating this market event into public consequence requires looking at the broader economic environment shaping this wealth. SpaceX is actively pursuing orbital artificial intelligence data centers to solve earthly power grid constraints, alongside uncrewed missions to Mars slated for 2030.
However, this historic wealth generation is happening against a backdrop of deeply entrenched and expanding inequality within the United States.
The civic context of this wealth accumulation points directly to America's tax and transfer system, which mathematically does less to reduce inequality than almost any other OECD nation.
The impartial reality of U.S. tax policy shows a consistent trend. The 2017 tax cuts heavily favored the top decile of earners, while simultaneously constraining vital public services.
Furthermore, despite the pandemic-era bumps that temporarily improved the standing of the poorest households under the Biden administration, census data shows those gains had already dipped significantly again by 2022.
The structural mechanisms of the tax code facilitate this concentration of capital. The wealthiest 1% of Americans currently hold nearly 32% of the nation's total net worth.
This vast wealth is largely shielded from redistribution through unrealized capital gains. The mechanism is simple. Founders and billionaires can borrow massive sums of cash against their appreciating stock without ever selling the underlying asset,
thereby legally avoiding income tax on that wealth. As artificial intelligence and space technologies advance rapidly, the societal mechanisms meant to ensure ordinary citizens benefit from this technological revolution are visibly faltering.
It is like owning a priceless painting. You can use it as collateral to get a massive bank loan to fund your lifestyle without ever actually selling the painting and paying taxes on the cash. It ensures the wealth remains untouched by the public systems that rely on tax revenue.
And while billionaires look to secure human life on Mars and build orbital supercomputers, the habitability of Earth is facing an urgent, immediate physical threat.
The World Meteorological Organization has issued a stark warning regarding a rapidly developing El Niño climate pattern in the Pacific Ocean.
Forecasters are warning this specific event could be the strongest El Niño recorded in 140 years.
The global disruptions associated with an event of this magnitude are immense. We are already seeing severe drought developing across Central America. Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, is currently under an official water emergency.
Conversely, the pattern threatens destructive torrential flooding along South America's Pacific coast.
The agricultural impacts involve widespread crop failures, which previous severe El Niño events have shown can necessitate massive global food assistance programs just to prevent regional starvation.
I want to clarify the actual physical mechanics here. Why does this cause both extreme droughts and extreme floods simultaneously?
El Niño is a naturally occurring climate cycle driven by shifting trade winds and warming ocean waters, but climate change is fundamentally altering how it operates. A warmer global atmosphere physically holds more moisture.
That thermodynamic reality drastically increases the risk of extreme rainfall and catastrophic flooding when it finally rains.
Simultaneously, higher baseline temperatures dry out soils much faster during periods of low rainfall, turning standard seasonal droughts into extreme, prolonged agricultural crises.
Today's story shows several distinct, immense pressures moving in very different directions. We see the fracturing of old geopolitical alliances and the rapid normalization of autonomous drone warfare altering the physical landscape of global conflict.
Alongside this, we see historic concentrations of private wealth operating entirely above the fray of failing public institutions, all while climate extremes physically reshape the environments we rely on for basic survival.
If our billionaires are focused on escaping to Mars, and our national governments are increasingly struggling to secure something as basic as a medical exam in India or an independent public broadcast in Europe, who is actually left at the steering wheel to fix the Earth we're currently standing on.
Thank you for joining us, and we invite you to visit clarenarratio.com for more daily world briefs and classic audiobooks.